Hi everyone, I'm Sonupam. I'm a former product manager with American Express. And today in this session, I will be speaking about how you guys can ace your next product management interview, right? But before we get started, I did wanted to spend some time, right, introducing all of you to my background. So I initially did my engineering and post that between 2009 to 2011, I was working as a software engineer with Hughes right? Afterwards, I went on to doing my MBA, and post that, since then, for the last 8 years, I would say I've been working with American Express in the capacity of a senior manager. Now, here essentially, I had an opportunity to work into distinct experiences, I would say. One was to scale an existing mature product line, right? So think of their credit card products, right? Predominantly, I would say in the US market, but also had a flavor of looking at, non-US markets, especially I would say Canada, Mexico, Australia, UK, and a few other Asian markets as well. Now, here are the primary use cases that I worked on is, think of, looking at the approval rates as well as looking at, the credit limits that we give out at the time when we approve a credit card. Also going forward during the customer life cycle, how do we increase or decrease your credit limits basis the actions as well as bureau performance. Another distinct experience which I had while working in American Express was around, conceptualizing and launching a completely new product line. Right, so I was involved in working on the consumer personal loan product. Right, to begin with, the MVP was aimed only at the US market, but going forward, we did launch it successfully in Canada, and next on the roadmap were a few other international markets, right? And more recently, I have made a shift to Walmart Labs, right, where I essentially look into products and features for the store side of Walmart, right? Again, predominantly for the US market, the scope of which includes almost 5,000 stores, right? Um, for the purpose of this discussion, I will be sharing my thoughts and pointers around, from the perspective of both the interviewer in some cases as well as the interviewee, to say what are the definite aspects which I believe do get tested in your interviews. And, I would share frameworks and certain tips that you guys can use in order to do a better job at most of these discussions or interactions, right? I would also be sharing my contact details, right? So my LinkedIn, Gmail, and Twitter. So happy to discuss more and connect on those platforms as well, right? Also a disclaimer, like I said, most of these thoughts, I have tried to capture basis my own personal experiences, right? And I really hope that you will be able to take away a few pointers or tips, which you can leverage in your discussions going forward. Okay. Now, with that introduction, I have prepared a few slides to convey and communicate my thoughts on this front, right? In my opinion, while you may be tested on a lot of skills, and it may actually vary, I would say, from organization to organization, and I would also say, at the level at which you're appearing, right? Whether it's a associate product manager, whether it's a product manager, senior product manager, or a GPM, right? But having said that, in most situations, I would say that these four broad themes do get tested in one way or another, right? So, what are those themes, right? So, first, I would be touching upon, problem solving abilities. Second would be analytical skill sets. Third, I would say you may get tested on situational or a lot of behavioral questions, right? And lastly, you will be tested a little bit around your technical skill set as well, right? Although this may not be the predominant skill that they may be looking at, but typically you may have rounds with the engineering team, right? Let's say with the engineering manager, where they will try to gauge your technical acumen as well, right? So in the following slides, we will be taking up these skill sets one by one and seeing what kind of frameworks or what could be some of the typical questions that can get asked and ways to be able to handle those, right? So let's dive deep into it, right? So the first one, like I said, has to do with problem solving, right? Now, here, what are the kind of questions that you may get asked, right? One very common question that you may have already come across or may have heard it from your colleagues and peers would be to say that, pick your favorite product and tell me how would you improve it, right? Now, as you would imagine, they actually, the interviewer is trying to give you a lot of comfort in you yourself going ahead and picking up a product of your choice, a product that you are most familiar with, right? In this case, you could probably pick up, I would say, a mobile app, right? Let's say maybe, LinkedIn or Instagram or Snapchat, anything. You may also go ahead and pick any of the hardware products, right? So depends what kind of product you want to speak about, right? And how much familiarized are you already with that product line, right? Another kind of question that may get asked where the goal is essentially to still go ahead and test your problem solving abilities, I would say, would be around product design questions, right? So let's say, uh, design an app, right? So let's say a navigational app for the blind folks, right? Or let's say design a refrigerator for kids, right? One very common one is that, how would you go about designing an alarm clock for the blind, right? So some of these questions or themes come under the category where they're essentially trying to test your problem solving abilities or skills, right? Now, here you would see I have laid out a certain framework which could really help you make sure that you cover the right pointers, right? And really streamline your conversation with the interviewer, right? Now, as you would imagine, a lot of these questions are very blue sky problems, right? They're extremely open ended. And the way to go about it would be to have some kind of a framework or throw some kind of questions or assumptions so that you're able to clearly streamline the problem, right? Narrow down the scope of the problem and then focus on a more narrowed version of what you would like to do in order to improve the app or in order to design a product, right? One another question that may get asked could be, on a very small feature in an already existing product, right? An example of that could be, let's say, the interviewer tells you that, let's imagine that you are a product manager with LinkedIn. And what LinkedIn has observed is that a lot of the social media platforms are really leveraging video format as a mechanism to engage with its users. And, LinkedIn also wants you to build something like a live feature where in which, the user base can actually go online and connect with their audiences in a video format, right? And not just in a text format, right? So this may be a hypothetical question that may get thrown at you. And what the interviewer may also point out is to say that you're not more interested in how would you go about executing this feature, right? Now, here, if I were to take a step back, your first goal here should actually be to ask a lot of clarifying questions, right? Questions that truly help you understand that why is building this product important, right? Or who is this feature really intended at? What is the goal of having a feature like this on a platform? Is it even the right thing to do, for a product like LinkedIn, right? So the way I would go about asking some of these clarifying questions would be to say, that what is essentially the goal that we're trying to look at? Is it broadly only to drive engagement from the existing user base? Could it be to get more acquisitions on our platform, right? So basically, get active acquisitions and engagement from people who do use such features on other platforms like, let's say, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, have them come to LinkedIn as well. Or could it also be to drive, I would say, awareness about the professional streams, right? Because if you think about it, that's what LinkedIn stands for, right? To help you connect to professionals in the world in order for you to be more productive, right? So could it just be to drive a lot more awareness about certain skill sets, from your industry, right? That could also be one of the goals for which we're trying to do, right? Now, once you have narrowed down why are we trying to do this with your interviewer, you may at this stage also want to think about a metric, right, wherein which you're trying to achieve improvement, right? So let's say if your interviewer tells you that the goal here is to look at higher engagement from existing users, then how would you really truly track the success of this metric, down the line, right? Let's say if it were engagement, would you, define it by a percentage of users who actually enabled this feature on their platform? Would it be, I would say weekly active users, right? So what percentage of users actually use this feature at least once a week? Or if the goal was to drive more awareness, right, then could you look at things like, how many views did this live video have, right? Or at its peak, what were the highest number of live viewers attending the session, right? Or it could be what is the, lifetime number of views or lifetime watch time of these videos, right? So if the goal is to drive awareness, then your metrics could be slightly different. Now, at this stage, there is one very important point which I want to call out, right, which is essentially here on point eight, right? While you're trying to think of success metrics, don't just think or point out about the primary metric, right? Think of about a few secondary metrics and maybe even like a trade-off metric, right? So usually I have seen that people will focus on, the positive growth side of every feature. But what about the negative growth side, right? What could be the downsides of having a feature like this on your platform, right? Few things that I can definitely think of is to say, could people use the live feature for certain activities which are prohibited on the platform, right? So let's say, could they use it for talking about, terrorist activities? Could they actually, be committing suicide and trying to film it? Right. And some of these instances or abuse of some features is what we have seen with other social media platforms, right? So, for example, on Facebook, we have seen instances when people have actually live shot suicide or spoken about terrorist activities or shown gunning events, right? So having such a feature like that on your platform could lead into such negative events as well, which is also something that you would like to track to actually gauge the overall health of the community, right? So I feel like those aspects should also be pointed out, right? The second thing that I also think about is around cannibalization, right? So let's say tomorrow your video feature becomes so prominent that a very high percentage of your weekly active user base only uses video as a mechanism to communicate with other folks on the platform, right? They've completely stopped using text messages or comments, right? Now that could be a byproduct of having a very successful feature which truly resonates with your user base at a given point in time. Now, while this may be a good thing, but you still have to be cognizant of the fact that is this something that the organization was trying to achieve with this feature, right? And also make sure that you keep in loop other product communities who may get impacted by your feature, right? So some of bringing out some of those aspects are also very important, right? Because as a product manager, you will be required to consider all trade-offs before deciding to go ahead with the launch of the feature, right? So in brief, I also did capture point 7 and point 8, which is around considering the various trade-offs and also thinking about a trade-off metric, right? Which could truly help you govern the health of the community or truly help you define the success of this new feature that we're trying to launch, right? The third point that I've written here is to around build user personas, right, and see that for each user persona how this feature could add more value, and what are some of the existing pain points that they are going through which can get alleviated through this feature, right? So having a very clear targeting strategy in order to say who's the user persona who's going to get benefited, what are some of the apprehensions or pain points that they have today which could get alleviated, right? And why that is important is because once you have that in scope, you will truly know the opportunity size of this feature, right? And then you will be able to tailor make this feature for the respective user persona, right? So going back to the example that we were considering, which was around, having a live feature for a platform like LinkedIn. So I would go back to think that who all are my user personas for LinkedIn, right? So on one side, I do have the recruiter community, right, who uses the platform actively to find the best fit for, for the position that they're hiring. I would also think of a lot of businesses or enterprises who you do use this platform, right? And one use case here that I can think about enterprises is that, especially in a world where everyone is working remotely, all of our all hands meet or all of our town halls, right, are happening remotely, right? So could an enterprise be interested in having a live having going live to conduct these all hands meeting, right, just to make sure that they're able to talk about the new innovations or the new kind of products that the company is working on, or just to be able to attract more talent towards this organization by doing this, right? I could also think of a lot of communities, or I would say content creators on the platform, right, which heavily create, I would say, messages in the form of like either polls or text messages or a lot of images, or also people who are admins of blogs or communities on the platform, right? So could they want to leverage this feature, let's say, to hold a live Q&A, right? Or if they want to speak about a topic, right, for generating more awareness around it, would they want to use this feature so that they can have live interaction with their audiences, right? And just make sure that they're able to truly communicate their message and solve their doubts or queries in real time, right? Another user persona that I can think about, maybe not so much for the blue collar jobs, but let's say for certain other creative profiles, for example, chef, they may actually want to show their live culinary skills, right? So if they want to share the recipe, so if they do want to share like a live recipe of something, for them it would make a lot of sense if they're able to show it live, right? Rather than, having like images and text to be able to convey how they were able to cook that meal, right? So I would say that you have to try and marry the user personas, right? What kind of use cases in which this feature could really enable some of your users in order to alleviate their pain points today. And the last thing that I would say is, when you're trying to think of execution of this feature, right, don't have a blanket that I'm going to roll it out for everyone, right? Because one important aspect of whenever you're trying to think of a new feature is to really be able to validate that there's a customer need for it, right? And truly be able to validate that your MVP, right, or how you have defined your minimal viable product actually truly works for all the use cases and users that you listed out in the beginning, right? So a good approach could be to suggest that, first I will launch only for a given type of user personas, right? And test out if it's working well. Or I'm going to keep it an invite only feature, right? Where in which users can send their requests and you guys can go ahead and see if a feature like this is truly going to help these user personas in achieving the bigger metrics which you had discussed earlier, which is around engagement and awareness, right? And you may also want to do it in an A/B testing fashion, right? You may want to really experiment around it, right? Because our hypothesis is to say that if I have a live feature, I will have a certain percentage of users who would actively be using this feature in order to drive more engagement or drive more awareness, right? You may want to really test it out by launching an A/B test, right? Run it for a few days, few weeks, depending on traffic on your platform, and then truly assess basis the metrics whether your hypothesis was valid or not, right? So have a very good go-to-market strategy, right? And make sure that you're able to convey how will you truly launch this feature or product, right? How will the rollout strategy really look like, right? So yeah, I think if someone were to be able to use this framework, it would really help them navigate right from the from the blue sky problem, and help them able to streamline right towards the actual solutions or towards the actual pillars or metrics that someone would take into consideration when they're trying to really build or conceptualize a feature like this, right? The second aspect that you may get tested on would could be essentially around analytical skills, right? So how data driven are you? What is your sense of knowing which all data points you would like to see before you're able to understand whether I want to prioritize a given feature or not? When that data is available to you, are you able to make relevant insights into it, right, and use that to drive your feature prioritization or influencing of stakeholders, right? And in that too, I would say one very common kind of question that gets asked is around guesstimates, right? Now here, remember, no one really knows the correct answer to it, right? No one is necessarily looking at the final answer that you arrive at. But what people are definitely interested is in the approach that you take to arrive at that metric, right? How do you walk through, top to bottom of that funnel in order to arrive at a final number, right? So in this case, again, I truly find that it's helpful if I take like an example and then walk through some of the steps that I've listed out on this slide, right? So let's say that the interviewer tells you that, hey, could you tell me the number of flights that apply in a New Delhi airport in a given day, right? So let's say that that is your problem statement, right? Now, again, right, the first thing that you have to do is to really streamline the scope of the problem by either asking clarifying questions or by stating your assumptions, right? So let's say if someone is saying, so what we're clear on is the fact that, okay, I have to estimate it for a given city, which is New Delhi, and I have to estimate it in a given time period, which is one day. But how do I truly define flights here or planes here, right? So some of my follow-up questions could be to say that, do these flights only rely on passenger flights, or could it include like private jets? Does it include cargo airlines, right? So let's say that you and your interviewer work it out to restrict the scope of this problem only to passenger flights, right? Now, the next question could be, do I take into account only domestic flights, or is international flights also in scope, right? Again, to this point, let's assume that you guys align on only looking at domestic flights, right? The next thing then I'll do here is to state out the approach, right? And look at certain relevant variables with which I will slice and dice, the beginning of my metric, right? So for example, let's say to begin with, I say that, because it says in a day, so I'm looking at a window of 24 hours. Now, the first metric that I will introduce here is to say that, in these 24 hours, how many hours are peak hours, right? Which means that planes fly at 100% occupancy, versus how many of these hours are non-peak hours, right? In which case my occupancy rate is much lower than 100%, right? So again, the way I'm going to state out this assumption is to say that let me assume that 1/3 of the day is my peak hours, right? So maybe 4 hours in the first half of the day, let's assume 8 a.m. to 12 p.m., and 4 hours in second half of the day, right? For simplicity, let's assume 8 p.m. to 12 p.m., right? So in those 24 hours, 8 hours are peak hours with 100% occupancy, versus the remaining 16 hours are not peak hours with X% occupancy, where X is less than 100. Now, whether you take this X to be 37% or 48% or 60%, that is really up to you, right? You can make any logical assumption around that. What at this point, what I would also suggest is to use like an absolute whole number, right? A number which will really help you ease out your calculations, at a later stage, right? So, which is my fifth point here, right? So, rather than choosing something like a 27% or a 38%, I may go ahead and say that in my non-peak hours, my occupancy rate is going to be at 50%, right? Now, the idea here is to truly walk my approach of how I'm going to approach this problem, right? State my assumptions. And in the end, I can go ahead and do some of the calculations to arrive at a rough estimate to the original question, right? So where we landed at was at first we introduced, the concept of peak hours, non-peak hours, right? The second concept that here we can bring about is to say that, typically how much time does it take for a plane to fly out from the runway, right? Again, I'm going to assume here that it's 2 minutes, right? Another metric that I'm going to bring out at this stage is to say that, in this airport, how many runways do I have, right, on which the plane will essentially fly? Again, let me assume that in Delhi airport, given it's the national capital city of India, I'm going to assume that there are two runways available at any given instance, right? Now, the next step that I'm right, so all of this constitutes the part of approach here, right? The next thing that I'm going to do is to essentially plug in all of these metrics and arrive at a rough estimate, right? So going back to my approach, what I would have concluded is to say that during my peak hours, I have roughly 8 hours. Every plane, and I'm running at 100% occupancy. Every plane takes 2 minutes, right? So in a span of 1 hour, I have about 30 flights flying from one runway, right? Multiplied by two because I have two runways, so that's about 60. And then 60 multiplied by 8 such peak hours, right? Which is around 480 planes, which will fly out from this airport during peak hours, right? So, and here again, I can round it off to around 500 planes. A similar kind of calculation that I'm then going to do head on the non-peak hours, right? So 16 hours working at 50% occupancy, right? But having two runways, every plane taking 2 minutes. What does my number of planes really look at in my non-peak hours? And then I can essentially add up the two and present that as the number, right? Now here, like I said, the stress is really on the approach and also, at every step, what kind of assumptions do you make, right? In the end, I would say that what is also helpful is to actually think of any edge conditions that may arise in your entire scenario, right? So, if this question was thrown out to me, I could think of, all of these things that I'm considering are my direct flights, right? Will anything change in my approach or calculations when I think about, let's say, interconnecting flights, right? So, flights which are essentially going out not from Delhi to a point B, but starting at a point A, stopping over at Delhi, and then going to a point B. right? So will that change, or will that scenario really change anything in my calculation or in my approach, right? So I may want to discuss a few of these edge cases as well to really have a well-rounded approach to answer this question, right? So I do believe that some of these pointers will really help you navigate through guesstimate kind of questions which may come in your interview process, right? The third piece that I want to touch on is a lot of situational or behavioral questions, right? Now, remember, as a product manager, you will be engaging with a lot of partners, right? These could range from your business teams to your engineering teams to, I would say, compliance, legal, to your UI, UX designers, right? So, multiple partners, right? So, while having a very good understanding of, I would say, or being someone who's data driven and analytical in nature, I would also say some of the softer skills also become extremely important, right? So I have some examples here, right? So for example, someone may want to test you, how do you really influence your stakeholders, right? Or how do you manage conflict, right? So what is your conflict management strategy, right? So one question that may get asked is to say that, cite an example when you were really excited about a certain idea or a certain feature, but when you took it to your stakeholders, let's say one of your stakeholders, maybe business, was not truly convinced that we should proceed with this idea, right? So then how did you go about convincing your stakeholders to state that why this is really important and something that the team should really work on, right? Other things could be to say that, how do you really go about forming a roadmap, right? So as you would know, one of the key components of this role is to be able to have a roadmap in place. It could be a quarterly roadmap or an annual roadmap, right? So how do you really go about formulating a roadmap and also, prioritizing the different features, right? So whenever you think of a question of prioritization, I would again suggest that you think of some kind of a metric, sorry, some kind of a framework, right? So it could be, let's say, the RISE framework, right, which essentially focuses around, I would say, the final business impact in the sense of reach, impact, and confidence, and also accounting for, I would say, the effort estimation, right, which is what the E in the RISE framework really stands for, right? Another thing that I would say is that whenever you are asked a lot of these situational questions, things like would start with that cite an instance or mention a time when XYZ happened and how did you approach it, I would really suggest, using the SAR framework, right, where you're able to clearly articulate the situation that you were in, what are the few action steps that you took, and post those action steps, what was truly the outcome or the result, right? And I would also recommend have two versions of this, right? Have one, really high level elevator pitch, right? So let's say, which you can wrap up in maximum 2 minutes, right? And also have a slightly longer version of it, maybe spanning up to 4 to 5 minutes, where you're able to stress or emphasize more on each of these steps that you took, right? So depending on upon the interviewer and also how long the interview is for, you may want to either go ahead with a shorter version where you can focus more on the action and the result, or you may want to go ahead with a slightly longer version where you are able to capture, truly the situation that you were in, and what exaggerated steps that you took to really help you manage that situation, right? The last piece that I want to touch upon is on technical depth, right? So one of the core jobs of a product manager is also to engage and interact heavily with your engineering partners, right? And what they would want to make sure is that you are able to understand their language, you are able to have a high level understanding of the technical architecture, and the fact that you are able to truly convert all the features that we spoke about into technical requirements, right? And in order for them to be able to do that, they may touch upon a few, I would say, areas as I've highlighted here, right? They may check your basic knowledge around tech stack, right? So they may want to know that, if you have a fair enough understanding of how the front end gets built, the back end gets built, what's the middleware, right? To support different features and functionalities, what kind of softwares or tools or platforms do you really leverage? They may also check your knowledge around the microservices architecture or MSA, which is what is typically getting deployed in, I would say, bigger organizations and also in a lot of startups. So they may want to test your knowledge around APIs, right? So you may want to, just have, ready answers prepared for those. The second aspect that I would focus on is the software development lifecycle methodology, right? So typically, what most companies would use is Agile, right? So having a very good understanding of the various agile ceremonies and in which all ceremonies do you have an active role to play, right? So discussions around that could ensue. And the last one that I want to touch base is on a lot of product management tools, right, or project management tools, right? So here think of Confluence and Jira, which PMs do use in order to create user stories and communicate what is exactly the technical specification of each of those features, right? So having an understanding and crisp answers on some of these formats will also really help you ace your discussion with the engineering managers, right? So in totality, I would say that these are some of the aspects, which one must definitely focus on when they're preparing for a product management interview. I would also recommend rehearsing your answers and maybe working with, your colleagues or with your, product management mentors, so that, you can get some true insights into, where are the places where you would need slightly bit more improvement, right? So that would really help you have crisper, concise answers to each of these questions, right? Um, so yeah, with this, I really hope that all of you had a chance to learn something new from this session, and that all of you would have at least a few takeaways, which you can then practice, rehearse, and leverage in your upcoming interviews or discussions, right? So I will be wishing you all the very best for your product management preparation. And if there are any more questions or doubts or comments, or if you guys would like to connect professionally, I will definitely make sure that I share my details in the comment section. Thank you everyone for joining in.